Welcome back to 20 Life Learners. Our speaker for today is Obakhe Bukula. She is a UCT Law postgraduate student and old head girl of St Stithians College. Her presentation today focuses specifically on how to rethink mental illness in all of its forms. In doing so, she highlights how it is medically, socially, and legally misunderstood and stigmatized. Since she was 12 years old, she has struggled with compulsive thoughts and was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder in 2013. This has led to a decade-long journey of learning about herself and the unique struggles of people like her. She takes us through this journey and shows what we can do collectively to make the world better equipped to support those who need it.
Hi, everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Obakhe. I went to school with Carmen, and I think that's how we know each other through 20 Life Learners. And I've been asked to talk about mental health and my journey with mental health, as well as, just common misconceptions, societal, legal, etc. And so I've titled this Method and Madness Towards a New Understanding of Mental Illnesses and Disorders. So from the outset, I'm going to be talking a lot about my journey, but it's going to kind of be a little bit academic in the sense that I have an argument that I want to put forward. And the argument that I have is that we fundamentally misunderstood what mental illness is and what mental disorders are. And that misunderstanding or that misperception happens in predominantly three ways, but I'll probably say four. The first one is the social context. So we've misunderstood it socially in terms of stigma, etc. Another one is cultural, in terms of our own linguistic groups, our own cultures, and sort of the situation that happens within our own cultures. But there's also a legal way that we misunderstand mental health, and that's sort of fed into by the social aspect. And finally, and I think this one is the most scary, we've sort of medically misunderstood mental health. And for me, the result then is catastrophic. So the first thing we need to know is we need to understand the beast, right? What is this whole thing when we talk about mental health, mental illness, and mental disorders? The first thing that I want to say is everybody has mental health. And that's important because it helps to dismantle the stigma that surrounds mental illness. So what I mean by that is when we look at physical health, for example, and we talk about sort of our physical well-being, we're looking at diabetes or cancer as sort of physical ailments that happen from time to time or that happen constantly. There's no real stigma that's attached to that, right? We sort of look at someone, we say, oh my word, cancer sort of awareness. We look at diabetes awareness, but there isn't that sort of relegation of those people to the realm of being social pariahs, right? We sort of have them as part of society. We don't look at them sort of in a weird light. But the converse is true when it comes to mental health. Even though this just happens to be sort of like a brain ailment, all of a sudden we've managed to stigmatize people who have mental illnesses as sort of being a deviation from the norm or a corruption of the norm, right? And so the first thing that we need to know is that everybody has mental health. And in doing that, what we're saying is everybody has to deal with this idea of mental health. Just like we have to deal with this idea of physical health, it doesn't mean that there are people who are corruptions or are anomalies or deviations from the cultural norm. And so mental health is a person's condition with regard to their psychological and emotional well-being. And there I'll probably add physiological well-being, because I think psychological and emotional well-being tend to do more with the mind, with the spirit and the soul, but it kind of forgets where the brain is at and how the brain is involved. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing is there is actually a difference between mental illness and mental disorders. And for that, I need to make sure that my words are correct. A mental disorder, the medical definition, is a disturbance of the normal physical or the mental health of the mind or the body. And this disturbance is also referred to as a derangement, and it may cause confusion or disarray, right? So for example, a person with an eating disorder or a personality disorder may be referred to as having a mental disorder. But on the other hand, mental illness is poor health generally that results from disease of the body or mind. And the difference between the two is that the mental disorder comes from sort of your brain and what's happening in your brain and the chemical imbalances that are happening in your brain. But a mental illness can come from anywhere else in the body, and it can come from environmental factors as well. So we're looking at an abnormal condition of an organ or a system of an organism that is caused by infection or inflammation or environmental factors or a genetic defect. Those are the types of things that we're talking about when we speak about mental illness. And what's important to note between mental disorder and mental illness is that mental disorder is actually very archaic. When we speak about mental disorder, it has sort of a pejorative sense to it. And so now we've moved towards speaking about mental illness. Mental disorder has a sense of abnormalcy to it, right? And we sort of look at it as being some sort of deviation from a cultural or social norm. And as a result, we stigmatize people and we alienate people from communities because we look at them as being disordered in some way or abnormal in some way. But an illness is a concept that we're already familiar with. We're familiar with the flu. We're familiar with a cold. We're familiar with, all of these bodily things. And so we've moved towards talking about things as being mental illnesses and not mental disorders. And so this was actually not type of disorders, but types of mental illnesses. And there are a vast array, and they're categorized by certain things. There are anxiety disorders, such as seasonal anxiety disorder or seasonal affective disorder. There are mood disorders. Mood disorders would be your bipolar disorder. Psychotic disorders, schizoaffective disorder would probably be under psychotic disorder. There's like a vast amount of things like depersonalization disorder, conversion disorder. Really, the list does go on in DSM-5. And so we get here to my story. Well, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder at the age of 16. It's funny because that was the first year that I was at my school, St Stithians College. And in April of 2013, everything just fell apart. I was reading this book that you see there called Q&A by Vika Swarup. I don't know where it is. I think I probably threw it away. But there came a point where there was a scene where the father was molesting the daughter. And that, having a mind that was already overactive, I started thinking a lot about it. What does this mean? What does this mean? And essentially, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder because I was thinking a lot about God and molestation, etc., etc. So that's essentially where I was diagnosed with that. But I can date back my compulsive thoughts to about 12 or 15. And then my second major episode was from January 2019 to present. Again, sexual sort of thoughts that I just couldn't shake, these intrusive thoughts that I couldn't shake. And I tried everything, you guys. I would walk with my eyes literally closed and just pray that nobody hits me. I would walk into poles. I would walk into doorknobs and car doors. I was a mess. I was borderline psychotic, and I am being treated for psychosis. And it was the worst time of my life. Yeah, there's no other way for me to describe it. It was the most painful thing. And I'm still dealing with the withdrawal symptoms of that, even though the episode still continues. So I want to talk a little bit more about OCD, and there are different categories of OCD. And these are sort of main four elements of OCD that sort of happen. And the first one is contamination and washing. You feel like you're really dirty, and that brings you a lot of anxiety. And so you have to wash everything in your house twice over. You have to wash your body 3 times over. But you never really feel clean. So it's this repetitive cycle of cleaning yourself. Doubt about accidental harm and checking. You feel like you are going to kill your parents. And so you hide all of the knives, and this is very common. You hide all of the knives in your house. You refuse to see your parents. You refuse to talk to your parents because you really believe that you are a mass murderer who would kill your parents and anyone in their way. Another one is symmetry, arranging, calculating, counting, those types of ideas. And this is something that I struggled with. I'll give you an example of symmetry and arranging and counting. It's something that I think people are more familiar with when it comes to OCD. It's something like my pencils have to be in exactly the right sort of shape and size. They have to be sharpened to the same length, etc. For me, my example was I had a obsession with the letters E, D, U, M, and S. And so those letters could not be the third letter of any word, or they could not be a multiple of 3 in that word. So it couldn't be the 6th letter or the 9th letter, etc. And if it was, I would panic. I just wouldn't be able to sort of function. And that's the reason why in my own experience with OCD, I didn't write my mid-year exams last year, and I only wrote my exams earlier this year because I had to rehabilitate a lot of things. I had to teach myself how to shower again. I had to teach myself how to speak. I used to speak sort of like this, and I couldn't really look out of my eyes, so I'd sort of look like this. And now that's sort of gone because I was imagining people in my room and all sorts of things. So that's pretty much gone. And so I've had to really rehabilitate myself, teach myself how to walk next to certain colors, how to wear certain colors, how to wear certain clothes, long sleeve clothes, etc. And then there's the last one, which is unacceptable, taboo thoughts and mental rituals, which is sexual thoughts, or it could be blasphemous thoughts in case of religions, etc. And so under these categories of OCD, you have POCD, which is pedophile OCD, something that you might not be familiar with, but it's this idea with POCD, sufferers believe that they're pedophiles, or they believe that they could be pedophiles. And so they avoid anything to do with children or, anything to do with kids. They avoid that as much as possible. Harm OCD, the feeling that you might harm yourself. Homosexuality OCD, which is the idea that you don't know what your sexuality is, and that causes you a lot of discomfort and unease. Scrupulosity OCD, which is largely religious, when we're dealing with blasphemous thoughts. Pure OCD, which is still intrusive thoughts and their compulsions, but your compulsions are not external. So you can't see me doing this, but I'm doing it inside my head, if that makes sense. And the list goes on and on. And so I want to first talk about social implications, and how, of course, social implications, I think, are familiar to all of us in the sense that we do stigmatize people who are suffering from mental health or mental illness, and we sort of relegate them to the realm of social pariahs, right? And that becomes problematic for people's, quality of life, in the sense that they don't get to live the same as other people who are not suffering with mental illness would. But in some ways, I think that's cross-cultural. It happens in a large variety of cultures. I think in my own culture, in my own family, they're a lot more overt about it. They're a lot more overt about, you are crazy or you are bewitched, right? But I think in Western cultures, or at least in Western affected cultures, you sort of see that alienation more covertly. And I think that one is a little bit more damaging because, you never know where you stand with someone, and you never know what opportunities, what advantages are being taken away from you because someone doesn't say it overtly, but they're sort of treating you as lesser than because of the order that you have, the disorder or the illness that you have. And so this feeds into the legal question. And we have an amazing legal framework. I have a background in law, and I recently wrote my thesis on this. But we have an amazing legal framework with regards to the Employment Equity Act, the Constitution, the social model of disability, the Code of Good Practice, which really recognizes mental illness and categorizes it as a disability. And by doing so, it affords a lot of the sort of reasonable accommodations and the protections that are afforded to people with disabilities, to people with mental illnesses, which is great. I think it's an amazing legal framework, and I've just really enjoyed reading about it. But the problem is that that's not the norm. And that although we have great policies, we have very poor execution. I am due to work somewhere next year. And last year, I really felt I just wasn't mentally ready to go into this big corporate job and, perform where everyone else was because of sort of the history that I had. And so I communicated that to HR, and the insinuation was, that I'm scared of being sort of in a corporate space, or I'm not up to the challenge. And that was really damaging for my self-esteem, but just damaging in terms of the fact that I was suffering at the time and had to deal with that as well. So I think in corporate spaces specifically, and in small business and business spaces, that sort of stigma rings true, very much so. And then the last one I want to speak about is medical mistakes. And with medical mistakes, what we find is in DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for diagnosing all of these illnesses, it's largely based on behavioral patterns. So you walk into a psychiatrist's office, they say, hi, how are you? How are you doing? How can I help you? Well, I've been seeing people. Okay, do you hear any voices? Yes, I do. They ask you about your family's history. They ask you about how old you are, what you're currently doing, what you're currently studying. And from that, they're able to gauge, okay, I think this person either has schizoaffective disorder or has schizophrenia, etc. The problem with that is the behavior of a social illness only comes at least a decade after we see the brain scans of such a social illness in someone's brain. So the problem with that is when we've diagnosed me, for example, with having OCD at age 16, the patterns for OCD actually started at age 6, which means that medicine has sort of it needs to catch up almost a decade. And is almost too late in diagnosing me with OCD, which I think is really, really scary when it comes to people's quality of life and just life or death situations. Policy solutions, I think we just need to talk more about mental health. I think it needs to be first and foremost on the agenda and life orientation. But I think that the government needs to take further steps in ensuring that the private sector and corporate South Africa understands what mental health is. Because as much as we are these educated people in these ivory towers, we actually don't have an understanding of how mental health affects other people, how prevalent it is, and essentially what the content of mental health and mental illness is. And so those are some of the suggestions, and I'm happy to talk to you guys about that I have in store. So thank you so much.
Thank you to this week's Life Learner. Please stay tuned for our next video.